Hello, Nyy'zai of planet Earth. My name is Zai Nyy'zai, and in this episode we're going to be talking about keening and stress lock for the Nyy'zai. Keening is the mechanism and manifestations that come out of a given human design when it's being used in an extreme fashion. So, is keening something necessary? Definitely. And the reason for that is because in order to grow in any way, then you need to be able to push yourself to extremes. So if you were to think of yourself as being like an athlete of any kind, whether that be a physical athlete or a metaphysical athlete, like doing something like studying, then you need to be able to push yourself further and further than you ever have before in order to kind of expand your current maximum level. So you need to have the ability to push yourself to your maximum potential and also have the experience to know what it feels like when you're pushing yourself to your limit. Understanding what it feels like to push yourself to your extreme and the different degrees that you'll be going through of kind of extreme usage of your powers will vary from mojo to mojo because they have different powers. So their hierarchies are different, and therefore how their stress system works as they put their mojo under extreme usage is going to manifest a bit differently. So at this point, it's going to be important that I introduce you to the concept of extreme momentum and extreme modulation, because there are two things that can cause keening. If your powers are going excessively and you don't channel them down your peak pathway, you just kind of keep revving them up, kind of like a car engine that's on like a manual transmission and it's on like a low gear, like first gear or something, and then you just gas it. Then, the RPMs are just gonna start just revving up, and they could go high and maybe even begin to go in the red zone. So with this kind of metaphor in mind, thinking about this metaphysically with you and your mojo and how you energetically work, think of it as it's possible to kind of push your system too far by kind of like over-revving it. And that may not necessarily be a bad thing per se. When you push the system, then you're kind of going to experience like a shaking of the psyche as you push yourself to your maximum capacity. And this is essentially how your bioship, how it shudders and shakes as it deals with extreme momentum and extreme modulation, kind of like how a car will begin to shudder and shake as you like gas it really hard and it's just zooming and revving really hard. It'll begin to rattle as intense amounts of energy are cycling through it. So that would be like extreme momentum, because you're building up energy and they're not yet channeled, so they're kind of just building up and kind of just revving in your momentum engines. Extreme modulation would be like you hitting the brakes and your car shaking as it attempts to like hold a curve and not slide off the road. So in this context, if you keep taking the engine into the red, then you can take it past the red and things begin to start breaking down. Then with the brakes and suspension, then you should be holding that cornering, and when you can't hold anymore, then you start to lose control. So keening is basically the point at which you are starting to go in danger of losing control. But it doesn't necessarily mean you've lost control. It just means that you're getting to a point where you could be in danger of beginning to lose control. And this happens in degrees. So it comes with a feeling that the potential of loss of control is coming up, and it's coming to a point where you are going to start taking penalties if things keep scaling up. Kind of like how in an RPG, then you will take consecutive penalties the more stress you're taking. So either with momentum stress or modulation stress. Extreme momentum is not necessarily a bad thing, it's just intense momentum. But when you have over momentum, that implies that there's too much. Then with modulation, you're going to have extreme modulation, which is also okay as long as it does not go into over modulation. So you should interpret keening in the same way that you would interpret signs of fatigue, either mental fatigue or physical exhaustion. So if you're pushing yourself to do something like studying or working out, then you need to know your limits. You don't want to not push yourself enough, because then you're not reaching your full potential and you're not really getting a very good workout. You won't really grow from that. But at the same time, you also don't want to overwork yourself, because that's problematic. You could pull a muscle in a physical sense, you could overexert yourself in any kind of mental sense as well. And that's just not a practical thing. It doesn't lead to very good results. So it's something that you want to work up to, like going to the gym for the first time. As you learn what's taxing to your system, you can do it in increments to learn what your limits are and work past what you previously thought was your limits. A great way to do this is mojo reading. When you first start, you're going to probably get fatigued pretty quickly, but over time it'll get to where you can go longer and longer and go in deeper and deeper without getting fatigued very early. But to do that, you're going to have to read to the point of fatigue and then recover from it. So thinking of it as like a workout regimen where you don't want to overtrain, but you also don't want to undertrain. If you come at it that way, then you should be good to go. So increasing your maximum output more and more until you get to a point where increasing your regimen anymore will be strenuous on you. So now let's talk about the powers of the Nyy'zai. Ni is major momentum for the Nyy'zai. So momentum for you is going to be, cross-contextualizing and riffing. Doing Ni momentum is going to give you a buoyancy of spirit in general. But if you go too far, then it can go into mania, which can be an issue. But it's important to note that there is not just a cutoff, but there are degrees which leads to this mania. The first degree of Keening for Ni is fantasizing. As you get your momentum going, then you're going to start to feel a bit casual with the environment. You'll feel like you're in the story that you're in, and when you're in the environment, you are experiencing it as if you're acting out a fantasy. When this happens, then you may begin to not pay attention to details that other people may find important, which is not a problem, because that allows you to be buoyant. That's how the buoyancy works. This can be a problem when you kind of just end up floating around and then lose track of things that you actually should be keeping track of. So the Ni fantasizing can also make you a little bit vulnerable, when losing track of kind of where the Vi is going. So you need to kind of use it with a safety net, so to speak, where it's not really a problem that you're losing track. You're kind of doing it in the right way, in the right environment, and where you're not putting yourselves in danger by kind of surrendering into the spirit labyrinth of Ni. The second degree of Keening for Ni is fairy flight. This is when you get really excited with your Ni and you want to begin to start pulling other people in and get basically get the action going, but in a Ni sort of way. So kind of increase buoyancy for all of those around you. This is a really cool power that Ni has, because you could turn like a lame party or a lame gathering into just totally popping one, because you could get people who are around who are just being lumpy you could spread your contagious enthusiasm onto them and just really, get a party started, or just create an awesome fantasy world out of a world that otherwise would have just been totally lame, which is really cool. But what needs to kind of be watched out and not go into over momentum is at the point where it might lead you to start being clumsy, or maybe with shallow with other people, or maybe a bit impetuous, or not considerate of the solidarity that kind of needs to be, just because Ni, when it kind of starts revving up into these high degrees, then it kind of increases entropy in the environment. Things get a little bit more chaotic, and if there are certain things that need to kind of stay solid or need to be respected in a certain way, then they actually need to be respected. So there needs to be this certain consideration for them. And so this is why the fairy flight, it's really cool, but you need to kind of watch out to not let it get too out of hand for those reasons. The third degree is delirium. Now this is extreme momentum for Nyi. Delirium can make it so you're basically literally getting intoxicated off of the possibilities and things unfolding. So when this happens, then it's like the Nyy'zai is combining the fantasy world with the actual world, which allows them to highly move people and be these magical creatures. But this causes kind of your energy to get really worked up. And at this point, you're beginning to go in danger of going into mania and having this turn into things like paranoia or thoughts being scattered and just completely out of control. The upside is this allows for tremendous amount of excitement to radiate out from you and into other people around you, and it could be a very high level spiritual thing. But you have to make sure that it doesn't get turned into a delirious dance that's just not fun. At times like this, it's good to have some kind of safety net or contingency, and also familiarity with the experience. So when the delirium begins to get out of hand, then you can scale it down to more manageable levels. But in general, when you get to such extreme levels of momentum, then it's best to plan ahead, know when you're kind of going into these states, because a lot of, Nyi Alpha in general, the Nyi Delirium, they'll summon it for things like performances or certain gatherings or certain rituals where it is safe for them to kind of be in these states, which includes kind of being in the correct kind of sanctuary, where with the right amount of people, where it's safe for them to be in this state, and there's kind of an understanding with everyone around you that that's what's going on, that we're all like, maybe it's even kind of like a mass delirium sort of ritual where that's what's going on and it's okay. So yeah, you want, if you can, then you want to kind of set up contingencies and stuff like that and safety nets so you're not putting yourself in any kind of vulnerable position. Next is your power of Nyy'zai, which is minor momentum for you. And so momentum for Nyy'zai is dispassion, reactive theorizing, which are both really cool things. And Nyy'zai in general gives you an unflappability of spirit, also something that's really cool, although there kind of needs to be a certain balance for it so the Nyy'zai doesn't become kind of just flat out numbness of spirit. The first degree of Keening for Nyy'zai is pure criticism. Now this is basically when Nyy'zai just gives a pure critique without any humanistic consideration at all. Pure criticism can be great because it's sometimes the exact thing that you need to do is be dispassionate of the humanistic consideration. But it's Keening because the criticism that you're giving is going to be biting. That's not necessarily a bad thing because sometimes criticism actually does need to be harsh. And sometimes it needs to be harsh for humanistic reasons. But it can also be too severe to be productive. And so this is why the Ji actually does need to have a proper level of modulation and consideration, so the slashing criticism does not become self-defeating. The next degree of Keening for Nyy'zai is logical labyrinths. Nyy'zai is very good at making prototype constructs in order to figure things out, but you have to watch out for this and make sure that it's being properly modulated by Ji. What needs to be watched out for is making sure the experimentation or theorizing is not just a circular loop that kind of just feeds back into itself and goes nowhere productive, but is instead a means to productive results. So you don't want to lock yourself up into some game world in your head, making this game become something that just traps you inside a bunch of rules. You want it to instead be a teaching tool that gives you impetus. It can be very intense to kind of just like lose yourself in logical labyrinths in order to run deductive experiments. This is kind of taking experimentation to an extreme, which is Keening, and that can actually be a really cool power. But, you just kind of have to make sure that it doesn't go into total stress lock, which is, like I said, locking yourself into kind of just a labyrinth where you kind of just place a bunch of rules that may not even be relevant to anything. The third degree of Keening for Nyy'zai is purging. Purging is basically an intense desire to make oneself clean, pure, unfettered, unattached to things that you shouldn't be attached to. This is very extreme Keening, and this kind of Keening could lead to very good results, and sometimes extreme purging is exactly what needs to be done. This can go wrong, however, if you sever useful ties or attachment or purge useful data. But sometimes this is also exactly what you need to do. Sometimes you need to cut loose what is corrupt or what is holding you back. But this does go into stress lock when you go so far with the purging that you're actually throwing away valuable or useful resources like relationships, lovers, friends, or getting rid of things like knowledge or information that you realistically didn't need to get rid of. Next, we talk about your power of G, which is minor modulation for you. So your G modulation gives you powers of social awareness, code of conduct, but G is also kind of a volatile power, and so this is where there kind of needs to be a certain balance or management in. The first degree of Keening for G is heightened emotions and logical immunity. When G is stimulated to intense degrees, then it could come with, you could kind of think of them as being like logical blind spots. And your emotional reaction can also become very high strung. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes what's needed is to actually be unreasonable about doing the right thing. Sometimes you actually do have to kind of just press forward and not really overthink it. Sometimes you kind of just have to just make a move. This does become a problem when it turns into full-on histrionics, or your articulation thruster allows you to kind of become blind to relevant truths that you actually do need to be aware of and not just kind of muscle through. It's not a bad thing to kind of go into G freight train mode, because sometimes that's exactly what the situation calls for. But this is Keening, and at this point you do understand that you are beginning to kind of go into the red zone. The second degree of Keening for G is caring connectivity. So you're really going to feel your good code of conduct and tribal relationship duties in which you feel you want to give to those that you care about, or be special to them, or be liked and appreciated by them, or be thought highly of and respected by them. This can come with a feeling of vulnerability though, because of how invested you are with these people. When G becomes overstimulated, then it can sometimes lead to being oversensitive and hyper-aware of how your code of conduct is being scored. And this might cause you to see slights in places where there aren't, or kind of overthink how you're being treated or how you're over-treating others. So it's very good to be kind of mindful of what it feels like when you're in these states, so you know when it's coming on, when your G is kind of becoming overstimulated, and when you're kind of reacting to these things through hypersensitivity. And it's good to kind of reality check yourself when you're in those states. The third degree of Keening for G is empowered persuasion. There are going to be times where, like, let's say for example, if your G is feeling threatened, then it'll use its passion and volatility and persuasive power to push through the problem. And sometimes that's exactly what's required in order to save the day. Sometimes you actually need to use the flex factor of G to, kind of shake the flex factor of the person that you're talking to. The volatility that kind of comes with G is in that of itself kind of a power. But what you have to watch out for is using this volatility to bully others to get your way, using it for unheroic reasons. Sometimes this is something that you actually will want to use intentionally, tactically, not just as a reactive thing, like if you're threatened or something, but sometimes you actually do need to kind of flare up the G thrusters in order to push through a problem. But this degree of keening is definitely starting to get into the red zone, because this can quickly become, just unheroic volatility bullying. Especially because with G, you can kind of get intoxicated with the G volatility, especially if you're getting results and you actually are able to kind of get your way just by pushing people around with it. That can go very unheroic very quick. So it's definitely a power that, great power requires great responsibility, and used for the right reasons. Next is your major modulation power of Vi. The first degree of keening for Vi is pensiveness, which you can basically think of as worry. Now, worry is not necessarily a bad thing. It's excessive worrying that's a bad thing. But there is a correct amount of worry that you should have for positive results, even if that worry is uncomfortable. Sometimes you actually need to go through a certain amount of uncomfortable pensiveness, which is appropriate in order to kind of get yourself going in the right direction. This is keening, but it can be very heroic keening. If you're worrying about something obsessively that's not necessarily, in such a way that's not necessarily useful or helpful, then that's when you're going into stress lock. If the discomforture that you're putting yourself through does not yield a healthier result, then pushing yourself that far is just causing damage. The second degree of keening for Vi is being absolutely on point. Being on point gives you a certain meticulousness of being that's going to be your major modulation, because you're going into a mode that will heavily modulate your buoyancy. Although a lot of Nyy'zai use this for good reasons, like for preparing for a presentation or a performance, or during either of those, making sure you stay on the track of the important stuff, or the plan. This is a lot of intense focus, which is a good thing, and that intense focus is modulation, not necessarily a bad thing. It gets to be a bad thing when you cannot flow because you're so worried and focused about sticking to the details, like sticking the landing, when you're so focused about being on point that you can't actually allow your knee to fly, because your knee is meant to fly. That's just how it's supposed to flow. So without that excessiveness, then being on point about important details is great. If you're allowing yourself to fly and still getting the benefit of being on point, then that's awesome. The third degree of keening for Vi is legacy and morbidity. Thinking about these things is naturally going to be far away from what is momentum for the Nyy'zai, but it can be very important. This is heavy keening, as it's the third degree of keening for Vi. Thinking about things like life and death, where your life is going from here, how much time you have left in general. This is very heavy thinking, but it can help a Nyy'zai go down the correct heroic path. So it's something you should be careful to not obsess about to the point of it just freezing you or makes you depressed or takes away from your resolve. But you do want to think about these things enough so it allows you to make more wise and more informed decisions and be prepared for what's coming up ahead. So it actually strengthens your resolve, not subtracts from it. So you want it to propel you forward and not have it become a crushing weight. Next, we're going to talk about something called the warning sequence, and this is how your psyche basically notifies you that there might be issues. And generally this works with your momentum power, starting with your source and going downward, where this is kind of going to begin with your knee source power feeling a bit off kilter, kind of just thought patterns are just going to be off of it. And if this isn't handled, then it'll go from your knee down to your Zhai. And if your Zhai can't handle it, then it'll go down to your Ji. And if your Ji can't handle it, then it'll go down to your Vi. And as it goes down powers, then the warnings kind of get more extreme. Like as as less of your apparatus is able to handle it. So this is kind of your warning system basically intensifying as it goes down your hierarchy. Then if your system is taking too much damage, too much acute stress, then it has a way of shutting itself down. And this is the shutdown sequence. This is actually in the reverse order of the warning sequence, where it actually begins with your polar, your Vi, going offline first, then your Ji going offline, then your Zai shutting down, and Ni is the last to shut down, because Ni is kind of the power generator that's always on in the first place. So it's the first to warn and also the last to shut down. You may have heard us throw around the term fetishing at certain points, and it refers to specialized ways that you're using your momentum powers you can think of it basically like using your momentum powers on the terms of your native powers, your native channels. And so when you fetish your modulation powers, then you're actually using minor and modulation powers in such a way where they're actually less costly of energy, because you are kind of pipelining energy that's generated from your momentum powers down into your modulation powers. So when you properly fetish, then you're actually using these on the terms of your source and tandem Ni and Zai. So momentum energy is actually being kind of provided by Ni and Zai, and then being channeled down into Ji and Vi. And when these powers are fetished on correctly, then you'll be able to pull off very high-level maneuvers with Ji and Vi in such ways that will seem much less taxing than any kind of use, non-fetished use, using outside of peak pathway. Some other terms that you're going to hear us throw around is the concept of stress lock or stress locked. Now, stress lock, this is basically overexerting your system to the point of damage. That's not necessarily something that's irreversible. You can think of it like doing an extreme workout regimen and then you pull a muscle or something. You can wait a week of rest. Rest for about a week, you'll probably be good. Time will heal it. The same concept applies to stress lock. You can take some time and, time will heal the stress lock as well. Stress locked, or being locked up, comes in with chronic stress lock, where you're actually pushing your system to a point of damage on a chronic basis. This could come in with, for example, like maybe a job or something that you're doing where you're just exposing yourself to damage all of the time, to a point where it causes your peak pathway to basically contort in such a way where you have bad psychic posture, in kind of the same way where it's like if a person has a job that's requires them to do some kind of manual labor activity where it completely messes up their body, overexerting themselves all the time causes them to contort on a chronic basis, and they stay contorted to a point where they will actually need kind of rehabilitation to put themselves back into a stable state. Well, this is the case with being locked up, where when you are locked up, then you can't really just let it go and then allow time to heal it. Your posture has kind of been messed up, so you're actually going to need energetic chiropractics to reset your peak pathway. So how do you put yourself back into an energetic alignment? Well, let's talk about resetting your peak pathway. You're going to need to basically reset your peak pathway to its factory presettings. And you do this basically by just immersing yourself in correct math. So things like mojo reading, being around your augmentation and inspiration mojos, immersing yourself in media that activates your momentum powers. You want to be around people, energies, influences of any kind that activate your momentum powers, activate your peak pathway in the way that it is mathematically and energetically correct for them to be activated. So effectively resetting your Nyy'zai peak pathway in the way that it was meant to be used. So know yourself, grow yourself, and save the world.